This is part 2 of a lecture series where we are focusing on the basics of genetics, and it's part of a larger genetics lecture series about Mendelian genetics. Now, in the previous video, we talked about the idea of what is a gene, this basic structure of genetic information, and how those structures actually become a look, which we call phenotype, which is determined based on a genotype, which is a specific combination of genes that you get after you combine what you get from your mom with what you get from your dad. Now, we also talked about the fact that this specific phenotype actually becomes from the relationship between what these genes tell you to be and what the environment tells you to do. So that sometimes the environment can activate or deactivate the expression of the gene. We also talked about the fact that phenotype is a word for physical, pH. Phenotype, pH, is an expression for the physical characteristics, which are basically a product of the proteins that you are secreting or expressing. And that these proteins come from the genes. Remember, genes, the particle of inheritance, which is also understood as the smallest particle of the DNA code, which determines a protein. Which gene is active is going to determine who you are. For example, all our cells have exactly the same genetic information in them, but they are different because they are expressing different genes. And therefore, that proves that the gene expression, or how the genes are open or closed to actually producing the proteins, changes who we are. And so the environment can also do the same and change the genetic code. But remember that you were born with a code, and that this code more often than not is going to determine your look, depending on what the environment tells you to do. And that is what we call the phenotype. Now, what we didn't talk about is how this phenotype actually works. How does the code determines the phenotype? Now, in a future chapter, we're actually going to talk about the process by which the code is translated and becomes the phenotype. How does the gene go from the genetic code in the DNA to the actual protein in the cell, in a process that we call protein synthesis? But what I mean by now is that what part of you that came from mom and came from dad tells you to be one way or the other. Why do you have a large nose instead of a small nose? So, and so forth. Now, we talked about the fact that you get genes from mom and genes from dad, and that you can get different versions of these genes called alleles. Now, what Mendel figured out after painstakingly doing years of analysis of the pea growth and looking at 7 different traits is that sometimes it seems like one trait overpowers another. Now, I'm sure that you've been in situations like this when you ask your mom for something and you ask your dad for something, and when you ask mom, your mom says, sure, do this, but dad says, no, don't. And then who do you follow? When you get 2 conflicting messages, what do you do? Well, usually you do what the most dominant of parents in that situation was. And so, a lot of times they say the same thing, but sometimes they don't. And that is the idea what we're talking about. Now, this idea of dominance basically means that when you have a book that talks about something, like an earth-based science book, have you ever had a situation when one book is better than another? Maybe you are assigned 2 books about exactly the same thing, but you prefer to use this book for space or this book for geology, but neither book is better for both. So depending on the character, one might be stronger than the other, and so forth. The same way with the genes. Maybe my dad said, please have blue eyes, but my mom says you gotta have brown eyes. And since the brown eye gene is more expressive, more stronger than the blue gene, the brown overpowers the blue. Now, that's actually a simplistic way of looking at eye color. I talked about that in the first video, and I talked about the idea that eye color is actually what we call a polygenic trait that has many, many variations. So many variations because eye color is actually determined by multiple genes. And we're going to talk about that later too. But if it was determined by only one gene, basically the easiest way to understand it is that blue eye color is only ever going to happen if all you have is genes that say blue. In other words, both the genes, the one you got from mom and the one you got from dad, say you need to have light color eyes. If the gene you got from dad says brown eyes, or the gene you got from mom says brown eyes, even if you have a blue eye gene, you're not going to have blue eyes because the brown overpowers the blue. And this idea of dominance is also displayed on that picture I showed you before with the flowers. That you have a red flower and a white flower. The white flower is only going to be white if both alleles, both versions of the gene that determines the trait, or sorry, the character for flower color are saying you need to express the white trait. Meanwhile, you can be red by either having two genes saying please be red, or if you have one copy of the book saying be red and the other one copy saying be white, the red overpowers the white. And this is what we call dominance. The one that is only expressed if by itself or by paired up with another like itself is called a recessive. The one that's always expressed when present we call dominant. And that is the basics of how this code actually works. Now what that means, and this is the beauty that made Mendel finally solved his problem of the flowers. And we're going to talk about in another video about how he solved that problem with flowers that we talked about in the previous video. But he understood that the root of the problem was that there was two ways of being dominant. You can look dominant by having two copies of the dominant gene, or by having a copy of the dominant gene and a copy of the recessive gene. Either way, you look the same. So while you have two different genotypes, the phenotype is the same for big B, little b than it is for big B, big B. Both of those will give you brown eyes. Meanwhile, little b will give you blue eyes. So there's two ways of looking dominant, but only one way of looking recessive in this example. Now remember that the environment can also play with this, like we talked about. Now the study of how these traits work, how they are passed on, the structure of the gene, how genes copy themselves, how genes become proteins, and how genes work and evolve is called genetics. And because of genes. But remember that Mendel never actually used the term genes. He called them factors. It was until later when Mendel's work was rediscovered that we started using the idea of genes. Now, when we do genetics, we have to do a lot of things. So as you see here, what we talked about, you go all the way from Mendel to modern genetics, which is trying to use advanced technology to actually understand and decode the human genome and seeing how we are close or different from each other and all of that. We also learn about the structure, both the molecular structure of the DNA double helix and the chromosomes. We learn about how these traits are passed on and also how they play with the evolution process. And you see here a pedigree which talks about how the traits get passed on. And so all of these things we're going to talk about as we go through this genetics unit and in the topic. Now when you do genetics, you have to do a lot of things with probability. Probability is the chances of a certain event happening. Now, later in the quarter, I'm actually in this video series, I'm actually going to go into explain to you what I actually mean by this series by probability. I'm going to do probability problems and teach you how to do everything. But for now, I want you to understand the basics. When you flip a coin, you can either get heads or tails, right? So that means that either you're going to get a 1 or a tail. So what is the chances of you getting a tail? Well, what are the possibilities? There's two possibilities, heads or tails. So they have two chances. So given the chances, what is the probability of getting heads? 1/2. What about with a die? If I roll a die, what is the probability of getting a 1? Well, there are 6 possible events. And I want a specific event, which is getting a 1. So the chances of getting a 1 is 1 out of 6. And that's pretty much how it works. The basics of probability. And so we're going to be talking about this in more detail and how to actually use probability to use problems. So those of you who like math, genetics is good because of that, because there's some math in genetics. But remember that probability is going to be important, and I hope you understand that basic concept at this point, because you're going to need that to understand what's coming up next. Now, another thing you need to understand in genetics is the idea of parents versus offspring. Now, when I use the word parents, I obviously mean the ones which are doing the crossing, doing the sex to actually create the children. Now, there's formal words for this. Parents are also called progenitors because they come before, they generate, genitors. They are the ones that generate the genes. So the progenitors are the ones that came before you actually have the children. Now, the progeny is what comes out of the progenitors. I'm not sure, I don't know if you know about this, but in science fiction they sometimes refer to the progeny of the aliens. That's like all those little things coming out of pods. So if you ever play a game like this, like a space shooter, you probably know about these progeny that comes out of these pods. And that's what it is. It's the offspring. It's another word. Offspring is the people that come out. So in this example here, you see that there's two purple flowers crossing to make several different kinds of flowers. So these flowers here is what we called the progenitors or parents of this cross. And these are what we call the offspring, the children, or the progeny of these crosses. Now, we also want to know how this works. Remember that the way that actually works is that the parents, when they cross, for example, here you see a green pod mixing with a white pod, making all green pods. So you have the progeny and the progenitors featured. Now, we know that the way this actually happens is that each parent does meiosis to create a gamete that has half of the information of each parent, which then gets sent to a gamete. This gamete combines with another parent's gamete to a process called fertilization, which then restores a whole, which is the new organism, which is how you can possibly get from two different things one thing. So, for example, so this is the steps again. Meiosis, create the gametes. Now you're going to get one gamete from a parent and one from another. These gametes will add together to a process called fertilization to actually make something that is fusing the nucleuses of both parents. So you went from a 2N that was each parent, and this is going to happen in each parent, to make an N cell that was the gamete. Now each gamete is an N. So when you combine those two N's in the process of fertilization, you again restore diploidy on a 2N cell. And so that is how that actually works. So gametes, fertilization, make zygotes. Now, in genetics, one way to actually solve genetic problems, and we're going to be doing this all over the next video, is to use a device that is called the Punnett square. Now, the Punnett square was actually invented by a scientist called Punnett. And you see him featured in the picture here. He actually worked with butterflies, and you want to look at the color patterns of butterflies and how the butterfly patterns were carried from generation to generation. So he did much of the same thing Mendel did, but he actually developed a system to calculate the probabilities of Mendelian crosses without actually using math. And so we call that the Punnett square. And it actually mimics what's happening in meiosis. Basically, you get one organism which has two genes, and then those genes are going to separate to form the gametes. Each gamete gets one copy of that gene, and it may not necessarily be the same copy, and then the gametes of one parent combine with the gametes of another parent to make a new organism. But notice that if you have parents with different kinds of gametes, you can also make different kinds of genetic codes or genotypes, which can in turn become different phenotypes or actually physical characteristics or traits. And so we're going to be talking about how that works and what is a Punnett square and how to use them in our next video. But I also wanted to remind you guys that this process of genetics, now we understand that meiosis and mitosis have everything to do with how sexual reproduction takes place. But when Mendel did this, we knew nothing about meiosis, and we knew nothing about DNA. So he figured out all of these things about these factors, which were later called genes, on his own. He hypothesized the existence of this particle. Now we understand that when he's talking about the parents creating gametes, that actually is meiosis. Now we understand that when he talks about the gametes rejoining, that's fertilization. Now we understand that the new organism, which is a new code, is a zygote that grows to be who we are through mitosis. But all of these things are things that came later, and so Mendel did not have this basic understanding. But as we go through the next lecture video, and we talked about the different things Mendel did to figure out this whole system, make sure you understand that the processes of meiosis and mitosis can be explained, or can explain what Mendel was actually seeing. And so try to tie that in to what the process you learned in the previous topic when we did cell division. So on the next video, we're going to talk about the crosses that Mendel did to discover this process of how things work, which I have been explaining in these last two videos.